On a chilly November 25, 2005, the quiet suburban streets of Atlanta lay still under a hazy autumn sky. Families were already gathering for the holiday season, houses adorned with lights that flickered warmly against the cool evening. Among them was the Johnson home, a stately residence nestled neatly between rows of perfectly manicured lawns and neatly trimmed hedges. Inside lived Amanda Johnson, known to her friends as Amy. To the neighbors, she was every bit the image of grace and composure, a beautiful woman of 38, blessed with a seemingly perfect life. Married to Michael Johnson, a successful businessman often away on trips, Amanda was accustomed to hosting elegant dinners and living a life that many would envy. From the outside, it seemed she had everything: the house, the car, the look, and the charm. But as stillness blanketed the neighborhood, a secret, dangerous and intoxicating, stirred beneath the surface. That evening, a knock at the door broke the silence. Amy answered, her eyes settling on Jordan Parker, the 22-year-old son of her neighbors, the Parkers. He was a familiar face, a young man she had watched grow up in the neighborhood. With a casual confidence and a warm smile, Jordan stepped into the entryway, and in that moment, an invisible line was drawn. What began as an innocent exchange, a friendly smile, a shared laugh, would soon set off a chain of events as deadly as they were unpredictable. Jordan's presence was magnetic, a breath of fresh air for Amy, who was used to Michael's absence and the loneliness that came with it. She welcomed him in, perhaps to fill the quiet, perhaps to fill the ache. As the two spoke, exchanging pleasantries about neighbors and holiday plans, Amy felt something shift, a warmth, a spark she hadn't felt in years. This was not just a friendly conversation, there was an undercurrent, something unspoken that lingered with every word, every glance. Unbeknownst to anyone, as they stood in the softly lit foyer, a dangerous attraction was taking root. Jordan, with his easy charm and youthful energy, represented something Amy longed for: excitement, freedom, and a reprieve from her carefully controlled life. He wasn't the polished, steady businessman that Michael was, he was impulsive, unpredictable. And for Amy, he was a reminder of a part of herself she had left behind, buried under layers of marital duty and domestic routine. As the minutes ticked by, the conversation grew warmer, more personal. Amy found herself leaning in, captivated by his stories, his laughter, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. A single, fleeting thought crossed her mind, a thrill, a hint of rebellion that felt as foreign as it was intoxicating. She could almost hear her own heartbeat, a steady rhythm pulsing beneath the facade of her perfect life. Outside, the lights of the neighborhood twinkled peacefully, but within the walls of the Johnson home, something darker, something forbidden, had begun to take shape. Neither Amy nor Jordan could have imagined where this seemingly innocent moment would lead them, how far they would go to satisfy the desires that simmered just below the surface. As Amy closed the door behind her guest, she couldn't shake the feeling that a boundary had been crossed, a door opened that could never be closed. And with that single act, Amanda Johnson took the first step into a world where secrets would be buried deep, and consequences would be deadly. As the days slipped by, Amanda found herself waiting, almost expectantly, for glimpses of Jordan across the hedges that divided their yards. It was as if a part of her had awakened, restless and unwilling to return to the quiet, predictable life she'd been living. On the outside, she was still the gracious Amanda Johnson, effortlessly charming at neighborhood gatherings and dutifully smiling beside her husband, Michael. But on the inside, a secret had begun to bloom, one that whispered promises of thrill and escape from the endless monotony. Michael, a dedicated businessman, was away often, leaving Amy to fill her days alone. Their marriage, though stable, had settled into a quiet, distant companionship, devoid of the spark that once connected them. Behind the closed doors of their elegant home, Amanda felt herself sinking into a sense of isolation, the walls closing in with each passing day. She could see the marks of time, moments and memories slipping by in the photos hung around the house, images that seemed almost foreign now. The vibrant, adventurous woman she once was had faded, and in her place was a wife, a hostess, a polished fixture in Michael's well-manicured life. But Jordan's presence, his youthful, unrestrained energy, pulled her out of that hollow, casting light into the corners of herself that she had almost forgotten existed. Their encounters started innocently enough, simple conversations at the fence, brief and polite. Yet with each passing exchange, Amy felt the tension between them intensify. It was like stepping to the edge of a cliff, peering into something deep, dark, and inviting. Jordan would flash a grin, his eyes lingering just a second longer than they should, a subtle invitation she found herself unwilling to resist. There was a magnetism between them, an unspoken understanding that neither dared put into words. One rainy afternoon, when the house lay still and Michael was away on business, Amy found herself standing by the kitchen window, watching the rain patter against the glass. Her thoughts drifted, and almost unconsciously, she reached for her phone and sent a text to Jordan, a casual message, an excuse about needing help with the garden after the storm. Minutes later, he was at her door, a slightly mischievous glint in his eye that sent a shiver down her spine. As he stepped into the kitchen, shaking droplets from his hair, Amy could feel the weight of their mutual attraction pressing down, the air thick with anticipation. They stood there, just a foot apart, in silence, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the tension. Then, with a hesitant smile, Jordan reached forward, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. It was a simple gesture, yet it felt loaded with meaning, a touch that left her breathless, heart pounding in her chest. Over the following weeks, they danced around the boundaries of their desire, their interactions charged with unspoken promises. A lingering touch, a stolen glance, each moment carrying them closer to a line that could never be uncrossed. Amy knew it was wrong, she knew what was at stake. But each encounter left her wanting more, and soon, the thrill of sneaking around, the risk of getting caught, only fueled their passion further. It was the beginning of a dangerous affair, one that would remain hidden behind the elegant walls of the Johnson home. And as the days slipped into nights filled with whispered confessions and stolen kisses, Amanda Johnson was falling deeper, further into a forbidden world from which she might never return. It didn't take long for Amanda and Jordan's fleeting glances and stolen touches to evolve into something darker, more daring. Each time Michael left for another business trip, Amanda found herself drawn to Jordan's easy smile and the reckless freedom he seemed to embody. She knew she was treading on dangerous ground, but with each whispered rendezvous and each hurried goodbye, her caution slipped further away, replaced by a desire that burned hotter with every passing day. It was a cold December afternoon when Jordan showed up at the Johnson home again, this time under the pretense of fixing a leaky faucet. Amanda had called him with an almost childish excuse, barely veiling her real intentions. As he stepped through the door, she felt her pulse quicken, her hands trembling ever so slightly. He was here, just for her. There was no one around to witness, no judgmental eyes, no prying neighbors, just Amanda and Jordan, locked in their own world, hidden behind the walls of her pristine home. The faucet fix was brief, almost laughable, a minor distraction before the inevitable unfolded. Their laughter faded, replaced by silence as they stood together, their breaths shallow, their eyes locked. Slowly, they inched closer, the distance between them shrinking until there was nothing left but the weight of their attraction. The first kiss was tentative, hesitant, but as their lips met, it was as if a floodgate had burst open. What started as a soft whisper of desire soon became an unstoppable tide, pulling them deeper, filling the empty spaces within Amanda that no amount of wealth or luxury ever could. From that moment on, their meetings became a carefully choreographed dance of secrecy. Amanda would watch Michael leave with his suitcase in hand, waiting just long enough to be certain he was gone before calling Jordan. The thrill of it was intoxicating, each visit a promise of passion cloaked in secrecy, the walls of her home a sanctuary for their forbidden encounters. In her mind, she convinced herself that no one would ever know, that their secret was safe within the confines of her carefully constructed life. But as weeks turned into months, the boundaries they had once clung to began to blur. Their caution turned into recklessness, each rendezvous more brazen than the last. They met at odd hours, disregarding the risks, trusting in the shadows to keep them hidden. Every lingering look and forbidden touch only fueled their addiction to the thrill of it all. Amanda felt like she was living in a dream, a feverish escape from the emptiness of her daily life. With Jordan, she wasn't just Amanda Johnson, the dutiful wife in the perfect house, she was someone free, unchained. By early February, the affair had taken on a life of its own, spiraling into something neither Amanda nor Jordan could fully control. The passion between them had turned to obsession, blurring the lines of reason and restraint. Even as fear gnawed at the edges of her conscience, Amanda found herself unable to pull away, each encounter binding her tighter to Jordan. The risk of being caught only added to the allure, pushing them both to take even greater chances, their one secret world growing more exposed with every daring move. But as Amanda stood by her window, watching Michael's car disappear down the driveway once more, a nagging thought flickered in the back of her mind: how long could this last? How long could they dance on the edge before someone saw, before the walls came crashing down around them? She pushed the thought away, drawn back by the warmth and excitement she felt when Jordan arrived. Unbeknownst to them, the perfect facade they had crafted was beginning to crack, and the stakes were climbing higher than they ever imagined. In a community where secrets rarely stayed buried, Amanda and Jordan were dangerously close to a breaking point, one that would change everything forever. By early February, Amanda and Jordan's affair was teetering on the brink of exposure. They had become bold, too bold, testing the limits of secrecy with each encounter. The thrill of sneaking around was addictive, a high neither wanted to lose. But their reckless confidence would soon be tested in ways they couldn't predict. It was a chilly Tuesday morning when Michael, scheduled to be in Chicago for a business meeting, decided to surprise his wife by returning early. After wrapping up his presentation ahead of schedule, he boarded an earlier flight, envisioning Amy's delighted face when she saw him. He could already picture himself walking through the front door, her arms wrapping around him in surprise. But what Michael could not imagine was the scene that awaited him. At home, Amanda felt comfortably secure, oblivious to her husband's unexpected return. She had invited Jordan over, slipping back into the familiar rush of adrenaline as they met in the quiet of her home, lost in their world of stolen moments. For hours, they stayed together, savoring the thrill, the escape, the intensity of a love that was equal parts passion and peril. Upstairs, the bedroom door was closed, the shades drawn, and every caution they had once taken felt like a distant memory. At 2:45 p.m., Michael's car pulled quietly into the driveway. He stepped out, carefully shutting the door to keep the element of surprise. As he walked up the steps, he paused briefly, admiring the calm silence of the house he worked so hard to provide. But the silence took on a different tone as he entered. Something felt off. He called out, his voice echoing down the empty hallways. "Amy," he called again, a question hanging in the air. He waited, expecting her to come down any second, but instead, he was met with silence. Upstairs, Amanda froze, her blood running cold as Michael's voice reverberated through the quiet. Panic surged through her veins. She turned to Jordan, her eyes wide with terror. In a frantic whisper, she urged him to hide. Jordan, caught off guard and half-dressed, scrambled to his feet, barely managing to slip into the adjacent bathroom just as Michael's footsteps grew louder on the stairs. With a trembling breath, Amanda composed herself, straightened her clothes, and prepared to greet her husband. She met him at the top of the stairs, forcing a warm smile, masking the terror beneath the surface. "I was just taking a nap," she explained, her voice shaky but steady enough to deflect suspicion. Michael, exhausted from his trip, accepted her explanation without question, placing a tired kiss on her cheek as he made his way toward the bathroom. Amanda's heart hammered wildly as he approached the very door behind which Jordan was hiding. The second stretched into an eternity as she watched him reach for the doorknob. Just when she thought everything was lost, Michael paused, his hand still hovering over the doorknob. In a stroke of luck, he changed his mind, muttering something about freshening up downstairs. Amanda held her breath as he turned and descended the stairs, completely oblivious to the tension that had nearly suffocated them both. The moment he was out of sight, Amanda rushed to the bathroom door, whispering urgently for Jordan to leave through the back. With a quick, tense glance, he slipped out, narrowly avoiding exposure. But as Amanda watched him disappear, the thrill that had once excited her was now tainted with something darker, fear. After that close call, Amanda knew they were playing with fire. The danger added a weight to their encounters, a sense of impending disaster that lingered long after each rendezvous. Yet, even with the risk pressing in on them, neither could bring themselves to end it. They were addicted to the secrecy, the rush, and the feeling of being on the edge. But now, each encounter carried a new layer of anxiety, a fear that every whispered word, every hidden kiss could be the one that unraveled it all. The walls were closing in, and they were closer than ever to being discovered. But still, they pushed forward, drawn to the danger, helplessly bound to a love that could only end in heartbreak. As Amanda and Jordan's affair deepened, so did the risks they took. Their once carefully concealed meetings became bolder, more frequent, testing the patience of luck. But in a neighborhood where secrets rarely stayed hidden, the veil of secrecy they'd relied on was beginning to tear. Across the street lived Mrs. Stewart, an elderly widow with a keen eye for detail and an insatiable curiosity. Known as the neighborhood's resident busybody, Mrs. Stewart had a knack for noticing the smallest irregularities, and no one could keep a secret with her around. Nothing escaped her, least of all the odd comings and goings at the Johnson home. She'd started to notice Jordan's visits, and each time he approached Amanda's door, her sharp gaze followed, her suspicion growing. One chilly afternoon, she watched from her window as Jordan slipped into Amanda's house, his head low, his eyes darting cautiously around. But as far as Mrs. Stewart could see, he was anything but cautious. Her suspicions piqued, and she took note of every detail, the time, the frequency, and the secrecy surrounding these visits. She saw the way he glanced over his shoulder, the nervous urgency in his steps, and the look of excitement she imagined in Amanda's eyes each time she opened the door. Later that evening, while chatting with her neighbor on the porch, Mrs. Stewart casually mentioned what she had observed. "You know, I see that Parker boy going in and out of the Johnson house at odd hours," she said, her voice laced with the unmistakable tone of gossip. "And always when Michael's away. Something isn't right." Her neighbor's eyes widened, her curiosity sparked. Rumors have a way of spreading quickly in small communities, and soon, whispers about Amanda's secret visitor began to ripple through the neighborhood. Before long, the gossip reached the ears of Paula Parker, Jordan's mother. A devoutly religious woman with strict principles, Paula had always had high hopes for her son and worked tirelessly to keep him on a righteous path. The rumors unsettled her deeply, stirring a sense of dread that she could not ignore. Confronting Jordan that evening, Paula demanded to know the truth. Her voice was firm, unyielding, yet tinged with the vulnerability of a mother afraid of what she might uncover. Caught off guard, Jordan denied everything, insisting that Mrs. Stewart must have been mistaken. He crafted a quick excuse, claiming that he had simply been helping Amanda with odd jobs around the house. But Paula could see the flicker of fear in his eyes, the crack in his facade. Though she had no proof, an unshakable feeling of doubt took root, her mind now clouded with suspicion. And Jordan, though he maintained his denial, couldn't shake the feeling that his secret was no longer safe. Every glance, every innocent question from his mother now felt like an accusation. The walls of his once hidden world were closing in, and the thrill that had once been so exhilarating now felt like a ticking time bomb. As he left his mother's house that night, the weight of the affair settled heavily on his shoulders. The excitement that had once fueled his passion for Amanda was now tainted with a gnawing fear. He was no longer just sneaking around, he was trapped in a lie that threatened to consume him. And deep down, both he and Amanda sensed that they were hurtling toward an inevitable reckoning, a breaking point that would leave no one unscathed. By the time early March arrived, the weight of Amanda's affair with Jordan had become almost unbearable. What once was a thrilling escape had twisted into a shadow she could not outrun, a secret that haunted her with every glance, every question, every moment she spent alone in her home. The mounting tension, the constant fear of being exposed, and the guilt gnawed at her daily. Amanda knew that their reckless passion had transformed into something far darker, a dangerous obsession that could only lead to ruin. Deep inside, she knew it was time to end things with Jordan, before their choices consumed them both. On the evening of March 5, Amanda made her decision. She would break it off, set things right, and try to return to the life she once knew before she crossed that fateful line. She sent Jordan a message, asking him to come over for one last meeting. The air inside the Johnson home was thick with unspoken words, as if the house itself sensed the impending storm. Amanda could feel her resolve trembling, but she reminded herself of the risks, the consequences, the whispers that had already started to spread. When Jordan arrived, he wore his usual confident smile, assuming their encounter would be like any other. But the moment he stepped inside and saw her somber expression, his smile faltered. She closed the door behind him, her hands shaking slightly as she took a deep breath. There was a sadness in her eyes, a finality he couldn't ignore. "Jordan, we can't keep doing this," she began, her voice wavering as she looked up at him. "It's gotten too dangerous, too risky. We're playing with fire, and sooner or later, someone is going to get burned." Jordan's face twisted in disbelief, his eyes searching hers, hoping he had misunderstood. "Amy, what are you saying?" he asked, his voice laced with desperation. The carefree charm he once exuded was replaced with an anxious energy, a desperation he struggled to contain. She had become more than an affair, more than a thrill to him. To Jordan, she was the escape he had craved, the excitement he had never known. And now, the thought of losing her, of everything they had shared ending, was something he couldn't bear. Amanda tried to stay calm, to explain her decision without letting her own emotions cloud her words. "It's over, Jordan," she said firmly, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "We can't keep risking everything like this. I have a husband, a life, and you have a future. We need to end this." But Jordan wasn't listening. His desperation turned to anger, his voice rising as he accused her of using him, of playing with his feelings, of treating him like nothing more than a temporary thrill. "Is that all I am to you?" he shouted, his voice thick with hurt. "Just a fling you can toss aside when you're done with me?" Amanda shook her head, trying to reach him, but his frustration grew with every word she spoke. "It's not like that," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't plan any of this, but we have to stop. Before it's too late." The argument escalated rapidly, emotions flaring as each of them tried to be heard over the other. Jordan's anger boiled over, a mixture of betrayal and heartbreak he could no longer contain. He reached out, grabbing Amanda's arm, pulling her close, as if trying to physically hold on to her, to make her understand. But she pulled back, fear flashing in her eyes as she demanded he let go. "Leave, Jordan. Now." Her voice cracked, but her resolve was firm. In that moment, something inside Jordan snapped. Feeling cornered, rejected, and powerless, he let his emotions take control. In a fit of rage, he shoved her, not realizing his own strength, not intending to hurt her. Amanda staggered, losing her balance as she stumbled backward toward the staircase. The world seemed to move in slow motion as she reached out, grasping for anything to steady herself. But there was nothing. She tumbled down the stairs, her body twisting and turning violently with each step. The fall seemed endless, a blur of sound and motion until she landed at the bottom, her body crumpled and lifeless. A chilling silence filled the house, broken only by the sound of Jordan's panicked breaths. He stood frozen at the top of the stairs, his heart pounding as he stared down at Amanda's still body. The horror of what had happened began to sink in, a cold, suffocating weight pressing down on him as he rushed down the stairs, calling her name, hoping for some sign of life. But there was nothing. Her neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, her eyes staring blankly into the void. In that instant, Jordan knew he had crossed a line from which there was no return. Terrified and overwhelmed by the reality of what he had done, he turned and fled, leaving Amanda's body lying motionless at the foot of the stairs. He ran through the neighborhood, his mind a blur of regret, fear, and shock, his thoughts racing as he tried to make sense of the irreversible act he had just committed. For Amanda, the story had ended in tragedy. But for Jordan, it was only the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt him forever. The woman he had loved, the passion he had pursued, had turned into a fatal obsession, and now, his life was in ruins, tainted by a single, irreversible moment of rage. The next morning, March 6th, the stillness of the Johnson home was broken as Michael stepped inside, expecting the warm, welcoming embrace of his wife, Amanda. But instead, he was met with an unsettling silence. His footsteps echoed through the house as he called her name, his voice filled with a slight hint of worry that grew with each unanswered call. A sense of dread crept over him, an instinctive feeling that something was terribly wrong. He wandered through the empty rooms, the quiet pressing in around him, until he reached the staircase. There, at the bottom of the stairs, lay Amanda. Her body was twisted at unnatural angles, her limbs splayed out in a way that left no question about her condition. Michael froze, the air around him seeming to thicken, his mind struggling to comprehend the horror before him. For a long, agonizing moment, he could do nothing but stare, his thoughts tangled between disbelief and devastation. Finally, snapping out of his stupor, Michael stumbled forward, his voice breaking as he whispered her name, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch her cold skin. There was no warmth, no life. With trembling fingers, he pulled out his phone, dialing 911, his voice barely coherent as he explained what he had found. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air, red and blue lights flashing against the facade of the house that once symbolized a picture-perfect life. The scene soon swarmed with police officers and paramedics, their movements efficient and methodical as they examined the surroundings. But amid the chaos, one figure remained calm, his gaze sharp and analytical, Detective Cooper, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for uncovering the truth in even the most perplexing cases. As he observed the scene, a feeling stirred within him, a nagging sense that Amanda's death was more than a tragic accident. Detective Cooper's instincts were rarely wrong. He noted every detail, the angle of her fall, the bruises on her arms, the lifeless position of her body at the base of the stairs. Something didn't sit right. Amanda's injuries seemed too deliberate, too severe to have been caused by a simple slip. The detective's mind raced, piecing together the fragmented clues before him. This was no accident, he suspected. It was something darker, something intentional. As he questioned Michael, the detective listened closely, noting the grief and bewilderment in his voice. Michael recounted his last conversation with Amanda, describing her as cheerful and healthy, with no sign that anything was amiss. "We didn't have any problems, nothing that would ever lead to this," Michael insisted, his voice heavy with anguish. Detective Cooper made mental notes, his mind already churning with questions. The following day, the investigation extended beyond the Johnson home, spilling into the neighborhood as Detective Cooper canvassed the area, seeking out anyone who might have seen or heard anything unusual. His inquiries soon led him to Mrs. Stewart, the elderly neighbor who had observed the comings and goings at the Johnson house with a sharp, watchful eye. With a mixture of concern and eagerness, Mrs. Stewart shared everything she knew. She recounted the countless times she had seen Jordan Parker entering the Johnson home, often when Michael was out of town. Her eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of finally revealing what she'd seen, her voice steady as she explained her suspicions. "I knew something was going on between them," she said, her tone laced with a mixture of disapproval and vindication. "That young man wasn't just there to fix things around the house." Detective Cooper's interest peaked as he listened, sensing that Mrs. Stewart's testimony was more than idle gossip, it was a key piece of the puzzle. The information about Jordan's frequent visits painted a different picture, one that suggested a relationship that went beyond mere friendship. Cooper's mind whirled with questions. If what Mrs. Stewart was saying was true, then Amanda's death could very well be the result of something far more sinister. The next logical step was to bring Jordan in for questioning. But even before Detective Cooper issued the call, the weight of suspicion had already started to bear down on Jordan, who sensed the noose tightening around him. The once thrilling affair, which had promised only excitement and passion, had morphed into a nightmare that was quickly consuming him. He knew that with Mrs. Stewart's watchful eyes and Amanda's lifeless body now the center of investigation, his secret was no longer safe. When Jordan arrived at the police station, the tension was palpable. He struggled to keep his composure, but Detective Cooper's questions were relentless, each one chipping away at his fragile facade. "What was your relationship with Amanda Johnson?" Cooper asked, his voice calm but probing. Jordan hesitated, his pulse racing, his mind scrambling for answers that would satisfy the detective without implicating him. But the cracks in his story began to show. His answers were vague, evasive, and the detective could sense the fear beneath Jordan's words. "I hadn't seen her in days," he insisted, but the alibi was shaky, his story unraveling with each question Cooper posed. Observing Jordan closely, Cooper noted the nervous tics, the way his gaze drifted away whenever the questions hit too close to the truth. As the detective pressed on, it became increasingly clear that Jordan was hiding something, that his involvement with Amanda was deeper, more intimate than he wanted to admit. And with every passing moment, Detective Cooper became more convinced that Amanda's tragic fall down the stairs had not been an accident, it was the tragic outcome of a forbidden love that had spiraled violently out of control. The walls were closing in, and Jordan could feel the weight of his lies bearing down on him. The affair that had once been his greatest thrill was now a chain around his neck, pulling him closer to a fate he could no longer escape. And for Detective Cooper, the pieces were beginning to align, the truth taking shape in the shadows, waiting to be fully uncovered. As the days passed, the investigation into Amanda Johnson's death intensified, each new piece of evidence adding weight to Detective Cooper's suspicions. The case had quickly evolved from a tragic accident to a probable crime of passion, and every clue seemed to lead back to one person, Jordan Parker. The turning point came when forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed a critical piece of evidence. Fingerprints, clear, unmistakable, and damning, were found on the stair railing where Amanda had fallen. The prints were matched to Jordan, confirming that he had been in the Johnson home on the night of her death. But this was not all. Further examination uncovered bruising on Amanda's arms, indicating a struggle. What had initially seemed like an unfortunate accident now bore all the signs of a physical altercation, one that had ended with Amanda's fatal fall. The mounting evidence painted a grim picture, one that was difficult for even the most sympathetic observer to ignore. As Cooper reviewed the evidence, he noticed how the bruises matched the grip of a hand, an implication that Amanda's fall had been anything but accidental. And then there were the text messages. Forensic investigators had recovered a series of texts between Amanda and Jordan, messages that hinted at the nature of their relationship, a hidden passion that was laced with intensity, secrecy, and, ultimately, danger. Detective Cooper examined the texts carefully, noting their content and tone. At first, the messages were playful, affectionate, even loving. But as he read further, the tone shifted, growing tense, almost confrontational. The last message, sent from Amanda's phone on the night of her death, was brief but telling, "We need to talk. This has to end." The message struck him as the kind of sentence that could bring about a dangerous confrontation, and in Cooper's mind, it all began to fall into place, a breakup, an argument, and a tragic end. With this evidence in hand, Cooper knew it was time to confront Jordan, who had already begun to unravel under the strain of guilt and fear. The decision was made to arrest him, and as officers arrived at his door, Jordan could feel the walls of his carefully constructed lies crumbling. There would be no more hiding, no more denials. The truth he had desperately tried to bury was now surfacing, its weight pressing down on him, making escape impossible. The interrogation room was cold and unforgiving, its stark walls echoing Jordan's own sense of despair. Detective Cooper sat across from him, his gaze steady and unrelenting. As he laid out the evidence, the fingerprints, the bruises, the messages, Jordan's attempts to deny his involvement grew weaker, his voice trembling as he clung to his last threads of defiance. But Cooper was methodical, patient, allowing each piece of evidence to land with the impact of a hammer, each fact chipping away at the fragile story Jordan had built. "I wasn't there when she fell," Jordan insisted, his words barely audible, his gaze fixed on the table. But the alibi he offered was flimsy, easily torn apart by the timeline Cooper had meticulously reconstructed. With each rebuttal, Cooper watched Jordan's confidence crumble, his mask slipping away to reveal a young man drowning in the weight of his own choices. "Then how do you explain the bruises?" Cooper asked, his tone calm but pointed. "How do you explain your fingerprints on the railing? Or the message she sent, telling you it was over?" Jordan's silence was deafening, his hands clenched into fists as he struggled to maintain his composure. His face paled, his mind racing as he grappled with the enormity of what he had done. The truth, now undeniable, settled over him like a dark cloud, suffocating and inescapable. In a final, desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of control, he looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and defiance. "It was an accident," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Cooper leaned in, his gaze piercing. "An accident?" he echoed, his voice laced with skepticism. "You expect us to believe that this was just a tragic mistake?" The room fell silent, the weight of the question hanging heavily in the air. Jordan's expression shifted, his defenses breaking down as the reality of his actions settled in. He knew that whatever he said, whatever excuses he tried to make, it would never undo the tragedy he had set in motion. His love for Amanda, once thrilling and forbidden, had spiraled into obsession, anger, and, ultimately, an irreparable act of violence. At last, Jordan dropped his gaze, his shoulders slumping in resignation. He had nothing left to say, nothing left to fight for. His life, once filled with youthful potential, had unraveled in a single, fatal moment. The affair that had started as a passionate escape had now destroyed everything, leaving only the ashes of his own reckless decisions. As the officers led him away, handcuffed and defeated, Jordan felt the full weight of his choices pressing down on him. The woman he had loved, the thrill he had chased, had turned into a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurked within him. And now, his future was bound not to Amanda, but to the cold, unforgiving reality of prison bars. For Detective Cooper, the case had come full circle. The evidence was clear, the truth undeniable. But even as he closed the file, a sense of sadness lingered, the tragic reality of love twisted into violence, a reminder of how fragile life could be. The trial of Jordan Parker became the talk of Atlanta, drawing crowds and igniting conversations across the city. The tragic death of Amanda Johnson had transformed from a neighborhood scandal into a high-profile courtroom drama, the kind that people discussed in grocery lines, whispered about over coffee, and speculated on in hushed tones. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse each day, cameras flashing as spectators pushed for a glimpse of the young man at the center of this tragic story, a young man whose passion had spiraled into deadly obsession. The courtroom was packed when the trial began, the tension palpable as each side prepared to present their version of the events leading up to Amanda's death. Assistant District Attorney Carla Henderson, known for her unyielding pursuit of justice, opened with a powerful statement. She laid out a meticulous timeline, detailing how a once-hidden affair had escalated into something sinister. Henderson's voice was steady as she recounted the evidence, each word sharpening the image of a young man unable to handle rejection, a lover who, when pushed to the edge, had let his anger lead him down a path of violence. She presented the evidence with precision, highlighting the fingerprints on the stair railing, the bruising on Amanda's arms, and, most damning of all, the text messages that laid bare the turmoil between them in Amanda's final moments. This wasn't an accident, she argued, her voice cutting through the stillness of the room. This was a crime of passion, fueled by jealousy and desperation. One by one, witnesses were called to the stand, each testimony adding layers of tragedy to the story that had already captivated the public. Mrs. Stewart, the elderly neighbor, was the first to testify. Her voice was steady, her gaze unwavering as she recounted what she had seen, the late-night visits, the whispered exchanges, the way Jordan would slip in and out of the Johnson home when Michael was away. It was clear to anyone paying attention, she said, her tone tinged with disapproval. Something was going on between them. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. The prosecution leaned heavily on the testimony of neighbors like Mrs. Stewart, their observations painting a picture of an affair that had become an open secret. The whispers, once confined to the walls of the neighborhood, now echoed across the courtroom, each account further solidifying the image of a relationship that had been doomed from the start. When it was Michael Johnson's turn to testify, a heavy silence filled the room. He walked to the stand with a stoic expression, his face etched with grief and fatigue. As he spoke, his voice wavered but remained composed. He described the woman he had loved, the marriage that had once been full of promise but had, over time, fractured under the strain of his absences. We were distant, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I thought I could fix it, that we could get back to the way things were. But I never knew. I never knew what was really going on. Michael's testimony was a painful reminder of the loss that stretched far beyond the physical, the loss of trust, of innocence, of a life built on the illusion of security. The courtroom was silent as he finished, his final words a raw reflection of a man shattered by betrayal and death. The defense, led by attorney Jonathan Reed, sought to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. He argued that while the affair had been a grave mistake, it did not constitute murder. In his closing argument, Reed addressed the jury directly. What happened to Amanda Johnson was a tragedy, yes, but it was an accident, he insisted. In a moment of heated emotion, things spiraled out of control. But this was not premeditated. It was not murder. As the trial neared its end, Paula Parker, Jordan's mother, took the stand. She was visibly shaken, her face pale, her hands trembling as she spoke of her son. She described him as a good boy, a young man who had made a terrible mistake. He's never been in trouble before, she pleaded, her voice choked with tears. He wasn't raised to hurt anyone. Please, try to see him for who he is, a boy who lost his way in a moment of anger. Her testimony was a poignant reminder of the families left broken in the wake of Amanda's death. For Paula, the loss was not only of her son's future but of the life she had built, now tainted by scandal and shame. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The room was thick with anticipation as the judge asked the foreperson to deliver the decision. Jordan Parker was found guilty, not of second-degree murder, but of involuntary manslaughter. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, a mix of relief, disappointment, and shock rippling through those in attendance. Jordan was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. As the sentence was read, Paula broke down in tears, her cries echoing through the courtroom as she watched her son, now shackled, hang his head in defeat. For Jordan, the weight of his choices had finally caught up to him, his life reduced to the cold reality of prison walls. The passion he once pursued with reckless abandon had turned to ruin, leaving nothing but the hollow aftermath of a love gone terribly wrong. For Michael, the sentence brought no comfort. Amanda was gone, and no amount of justice could erase the memory of finding her lifeless body at the foot of the stairs. The man who had once loved her now carried a grief that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And as he left the courthouse, the pitying glances and whispered condolences reminded him that his loss was a wound the world would continue to examine long after the trial was over. The story of Amanda Johnson's tragic death spread beyond Atlanta, a cautionary tale of desire, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions. In the end, the secrets that had been hidden behind closed doors were exposed for all to see, leaving a community fractured and two families shattered. The Johnsons' home, once a symbol of success and stability, became an empty shell, haunted by memories of a life that could never be reclaimed. And for the people who had followed the case, the story served as a stark reminder: sometimes, the greatest dangers lie not in the darkness beyond, but in the secrets we hold closest, hidden in the shadows of our own lives. The verdict marked the end of a tragic chapter, but the consequences of Amanda Johnson's death continued to ripple through the lives of everyone it had touched. The neighborhood, once a tight-knit community, was left fractured, burdened by the weight of the scandal that had unfolded within its boundaries. What had once been a place of safety, friendship, and familiarity now felt strained, each corner holding a whisper of the events that had rocked their quiet street. The Johnsons' house, with its perfectly trimmed hedges and carefully maintained facade, had become a haunting reminder of secrets buried beneath polished appearances. For Michael Johnson, the days after the trial were a blur of grief and silent suffering. The loss of his wife, compounded by the revelations of her affair, left him feeling hollow. The home he had once worked so hard to build felt like a prison, each room a reminder of the betrayal that had shattered his life. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, every corner of the house held memories of a life that was no longer his. Amanda's laughter, once a comforting presence, now echoed like a distant memory, taunting him with the ghost of what had once been. In the end, Michael made the difficult decision to leave. He sold the house, packed away the remnants of his former life, and moved to a new city, hoping to escape the painful memories that clung to the walls of his home. He needed, a fresh start, a place where no one knew his name, where he could begin to rebuild without the shadow of Amanda's death hanging over him. But moving away did not bring the peace he had hoped for. The haunting memories followed him, a constant reminder of the life he had lost. At night, he would wake to the phantom sounds of Amanda's voice, the echoes of a life that had been irrevocably torn apart. Though he tried to escape the past, it lingered in the recesses of his mind, a wound that time alone could not heal. For Paula Parker, the pain of the trial and the sentence that followed left a mark that went deeper than mere disappointment. She had not only lost her son to the prison system but had also endured the whispers and stares of a community that now regarded her with a mixture of pity and disdain. The once lively, respected woman withdrew from her neighbors, retreating into her home, avoiding the eyes that once greeted her warmly. In the quiet of her living room, she would sit, reflecting on the choices that had led her son to this fate. The questions were endless. Could she have done more? Had she missed the signs? The guilt weighed heavily on her, a constant companion that shadowed her every thought. Paula's once regular visits to the local church became sporadic. The community she had once cherished now felt alien, her presence met with awkward glances and hesitant conversations. Even those who meant well struggled to find the words to console her. She could sense the unspoken judgment, the quiet blame that lingered in the air. To the world, her son was now a criminal, his life marred by a single act that had changed everything. Inside the prison walls, Jordan Parker grappled with the stark reality of his actions. The world he had known was gone, replaced by a gray, unyielding existence. His days were filled with routine, each one blending into the next in a monotonous cycle of regret and remorse. The thrill and excitement that had once defined his life with Amanda were now distant memories, replaced by the harsh truth of his choices. Every day, he relived the moment at the top of the staircase, the look in Amanda's eyes, the panic that had spiraled into tragedy. He could not escape the weight of his guilt, the knowledge that his own hands had taken a life he had once claimed to cherish. Letters from his mother arrived weekly, each one filled with words of encouragement and love, yet laced with the sadness that neither of them could escape. Paula's letters were his only connection to the outside world, a small glimpse of the life he had lost. But even her words could not erase the overwhelming emptiness that filled his days. In the quiet moments, Jordan would stare at the prison walls, wondering if he would ever find redemption or if his life was forever bound to this endless cycle of regret. Back in the neighborhood, life continued, but the Johnsons' house remained a scar on the landscape. New owners moved in eventually, but for those who had witnessed the scandal firsthand, the house was forever changed, a symbol of the tragedy that had shaken them all. The story of Amanda Johnson's death became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily secrets could destroy lives and how the allure of forbidden passion could spiral into devastation. For years to come, residents of the neighborhood would speak of Amanda and Jordan in hushed tones, their story a dark reminder of the consequences that could lurk beneath even the most pristine facades. In the end, the story of Amanda Johnson and Jordan Parker became more than a scandal, it became a legend, a whispered tale of love, betrayal, and the unforgiving price of secrecy. And while the neighborhood eventually found its peace, the memory of Amanda's death lingered, a silent shadow cast over the lives of everyone it had touched.